The Peloponnesian War. Antiquity's most well-documented and destructive civil conflict. A war of a huge scale, given the capabilities of the era, with clashes all around the Mediterranean and mainland Greece, with unexpected victories, crushing defeats, and tactical maneuvers to echo through history. All of these in order to achieve something much more than simple dominance over the enemy. The Peloponnesian War was a war of ideology, democracy versus oligarchy, martial prudence versus civic innovation. Thousands of young Athenians and Spartans, along numerous of their allies, would die for what they held as the most sacred: reputation, honor, and identity. Or at least, that's what they were taught to believe. Because as young men were slaughtered in the thousands, the internal elites of both Athens and Sparta were making sure that through this sacrifice, their internal systems of wealth and governance remained unchanged. Through a modern reading of the events, we will try to uncover the hidden motives and deeper strategies that shaped the war that scarred ancient Greece forever. Ancient Greece, from the start of the Archaic period, consisted of a multitude of city-states, each with its own laws and customs, however, all of them bonded over language and religion. By the 5th century BC, Sparta and Athens were the two leading Greek powers, often contrasted for their differences. Sparta, the premier land power, sat on the fertile plains of Laconia. It was an inward-looking agrarian society dominated by a narrow warrior elite. Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, lived atop a social volcano. The helots, a servile majority of conquered Messenians and Laconians bound to the soil. Helots vastly outnumbered Spartan citizens. Herodotus implies roughly 7 helots per Spartiate in the Spartan contingent at Plataea in 479 BC, while later writers sometimes put the imbalance even higher. To maintain this precarious balance, Sparta developed an austere, militarized oligarchy. Every Spartan male trained from childhood for war and social discipline. What we often call Spartan virtues of discipline and frugality were in fact necessities imposed by constant fear of helot revolt. Sparta hoarded political power within a small elite, strictly limiting citizenship and brutally repressing the helot population to preserve its social order. Just 200 kilometers north of Sparta lay Athens. Athens, by contrast, was a naval power facing the Aegean Sea. With poorer soil, better for olives than grain, and excellent harbors, Athens turned to trade, seafaring, and colonization. In the 5th century BC, it developed a radical democracy, in which even poor citizens, the thetes, could vote in the assembly and serve in juries, a system sustained in part by the city's naval empire. Public life in Athens became a grand contest for honor and prestige. Athenian culture celebrated what they called eudaimonia, the drive to be the best you can be, where taking bold risks was almost a civic duty. All in all, both Athens and Sparta spoke the language of honor and reputation as a kind of social currency. Both were very exclusive in granting citizenship. Even Athens kept citizenship limited, despite its inclusiveness among citizens. Both saw politics as an arena of constant competition among ambitious men. And importantly, both city-states jealously guarded their internal status hierarchies, even as they championed very different political ideals: freedom and democracy in Athens versus order and oligarchy in Sparta. This last point is key. When pressures mounted, Athens and Sparta alike tended to protect their status architecture before seeking quick victories. Each society had a fixed number of elite positions: generals, magistrates, councilmen in Athens, kings, ephors, geronts in Sparta, and fiercely maintained the privileges of those positions. Political life in both cities was like a tournament with only so many chairs for the winners. In democratic Athens, rivals who threatened the equilibrium could even be ostracized, banished by popular vote for 10 years. Ostracism, intended to preempt would-be tyrants, was described by later writers as a punishment worse than death, since an exiled Athenian lost not only home and family, but the civic identity that could not easily be earned elsewhere. In oligarchic Sparta, the prospect of any change to the rigid social order, such as freeing helots or admitting new citizens, provoked deep alarm among the ruling class. These internal social tensions, often overshadowed by the ideological clash of democracy versus oligarchy, would crucially shape the outbreak and conduct of the Peloponnesian War. According to Thucydides, the fundamental cause of the Peloponnesian War was the rise of Athenian power and the fear it inspired in Sparta, which made conflict inevitable. Athens grew from the leader of the anti-Persian Delian League into a true empire, dominating the Aegean and surrounding seas. Sparta, leader of the Peloponnesian League, viewed Athens' expansion with alarm. As tension mounted, the Greek world split into opposing blocs, and mutual suspicions sharpened: democracy versus oligarchy, sea power versus land power. In 431 BC, after a series of disputes and proxy clashes, open war erupted. The traditional telling emphasizes fear, honor, and interest as drivers, a status quo power confronting a rising power, the so-called Thucydidean trap. Ideological distrust between political systems and strategic miscalculations, all compounded by unforeseen disasters like the plague at Athens. Those factors are all true. And yet, if fear, ideology, or even sheer profit were the sole drivers, a curious question arises. Why didn't either side take the most decisive strategic shortcuts for victory? For example, Athens, commanding the seas, might have directly threatened Sparta's home turf. Spartan power rested on keeping the helots subdued. The obvious move for Athens would be to sail to Laconia, fortify a base on the coast, and arm the helots to foment a massive rebellion. In theory, Athens could have landed troops to destabilize Messenia, forcing Sparta to fight for its very existence. Indeed, at one point, Athens did establish a foothold at Pylos in Spartan territory, and hundreds of helots defected to that garrison, causing panic in Sparta and showing the potential of such a strategy. But Athens never made a full-scale effort to turn the helots against their masters. Conversely, Sparta seldom tried to incite revolt directly among Athens' large enslaved population or to promise sweeping freedom to Athenian subject peoples until very late in the war. Sparta's major push into naval empire building, with Persian help, came only in the final phase. For most of the conflict, both sides seemed reluctant to press their advantages to a crushing conclusion. The war dragged on for 27 years and ended with surprisingly moderate terms for the defeated Athens. There was no annihilation or mass enslavement of the Athenian populace in 404 BC, a stark contrast to the usual fate of conquered cities in antiquity. These observations pose a puzzle. If both sides were fighting for survival or hegemony, why did they forgo such obvious measures to speed up victory? Why a drawn-out war of attrition, season after season, instead of decisive blows? Why, when final victory came, were the terms so lenient that the defeated polis was not dismantled from within? And why do we see parallel events on both sides in 422 BC, the deaths of Cleon and Brasidas, that removed the two individuals most likely to force revolutionary change at home? To answer this, we need to step back and examine the war through a different lens, not just as an interstate conflict, but as an internal contest within each state's elite, driven by a condition modern scholars call elite overproduction. An illuminating metaphor for the concept of elite overproduction comes from John B. Calhoun's mid-20th century rat utopia experiments. In enclosures with abundant food, water, and safety, rat populations boomed until social roles became overcrowded. Then, behavior collapsed. Cliques formed, rituals broke down, violence spiked, and reproduction faltered even though resources remained plentiful. The metaphor is limited, but powerful. When status roles are fixed and scarce, while aspirants multiply, competition turns inward and destructive. In a closed system with limited high-status niches, frustrated contenders lash out or disengage. The rules that once kept rivalry bound start to erode. This is the backdrop for elite overproduction in human societies. The term was popularized by cliodynamics researcher Peter Turchin and describes a situation where the number of people qualified for elite status grows faster than the number of elite positions available. After prosperity or expansion, you often see more wealthy, educated, or prestigious individuals aspiring to high office than there are offices or honors to occupy. The result is a cruel game of musical chairs among the upper classes. When this happens, politics shift inward, factions harden, rhetoric intensifies, and public life takes on a zero-sum character. One escape is to open the summit, add offices, rotate them more quickly, broaden citizenship. If the ruling class resists, the remaining outlets for ambition can turn dark. Purges, coups, populist uprisings, or long wars of attrition that slowly ration out glory and thin the ranks. On the eve of war, both Athens and Sparta show symptoms of elite overproduction. In Athens, democracy and empire had created many new power contenders beyond the old aristocracy: demagogues, generals, orators. Beneath Pericles, many competed for prominence. In Sparta, isolation and rigidity meant stasis in the ruling class. The number of full Spartiates declined over time due to war and a harsh educational regime. By 431 BC, Sparta was notoriously short of citizens, perhaps fewer than 3,000 to 4,000 adult male Spartiates, while discontent brewed among lesser status groups like the Perikoi and the ever-restive helots. Athens had too many rising elites pushing at the gates. Sparta had too few citizens, and a brittle hierarchy terrified of empowering anyone outside the elite circle. Both were primed for internal status crises. This lens helps clarify many choices during the Peloponnesian War. A classic way to relieve elite pressure is imperial expansion. Conquest brings resources, land, tribute, enslaved labor, and opens new posts that can be doled out to restless elites. For example, by the 440s BC, Athens had transformed the Delian League into an Athenian empire. Under Pericles, tribute funded grand works like the Parthenon that beautified the city and provided years of paid work. Additionally, stipends for jurors and other public pay tied poorer citizens' livelihoods to imperial success. Expanding the empire, in effect, created more chairs, magistracies, generalships, naval commands, colonial grants, paid posts, absorbing ambitious energy. Patronage networks formed around imperial revenue, and the common people saw their prosperity linked to maintaining the imperial status quo. But empire also pumps elite competition. Each triumphant admiral, wealthy liturgy performer, citizens who sponsored triremes or festivals, or victorious colonial governor adds to the pool of men with claims to leadership. Success breeds more aspirants faster than new offices. By the war's start, Athens was near this tipping point. Meanwhile, Sparta's long aversion to distant empire meant no similar safety valve until late in the war, when, with Persian gold, it briefly experimented with naval hegemony and installed governors and oligarchies in former Athenian territories. That flirtation elevated figures like Lysander, a non-royal Spartan whose prominence unsettled the old order. When the external frontier closes or backfires, pressure rushes home. As the tribute pump faltered, revolts, war drain, Persian intervention, Athenian elite competition intensified domestically. Rather than expand the ruling circle, Athens often chose prolonged war or factional purges. Sparta, faced with manpower needs, armed select helots in exchange for freedom, then quickly reverted to form. In short, the war reads not only as Athens versus Sparta, but as each society's establishment managing challenges from within. The war opened in 431 BC. Pericles' unorthodox move for a land war was to refuse pitched battle, evacuate Attica's countryside, and shelter behind the long walls, while the navy raided Peloponnesian coasts and kept grain flowing. Militarily, this neutralized Sparta's hoplite superiority and played to Athenian strengths at sea and in finance. Politically, it preserved internal order. A catastrophic land defeat might have toppled the democracy and empowered Pericles' rivals. The naval strategy kept the war effort in domains Pericles could control: imperial logistics, finance, and fleet command, keeping ambitious younger men busy abroad rather than challenging authority at home. The human cost was brutal. Every summer, Athenians watched their farms burn. Overcrowding inside the city led to disease, and in 430 BC a plague devastated Athens for 2 years, perhaps killing a quarter to a third of the population, including Pericles' sons and Pericles himself in 429. Yet, even bereft of its architect, Athens kept the basic strategy, a sign of how deeply it was tied to preserving the city's social order. The empire machine still turned, strained, but intact. Into the leadership vacuum stepped bolder figures, products of the very elite competition Pericles had managed so carefully. However, there would arise figures to challenge the status quo: Cleon in Athens and Brasidas in Sparta. Cleon, a leather tanner turned politician, championed Zeugitai and Thetes, the lower Athenian classes, and pushed an offensive war. His moment came at Pylos Facteria, 425 BC, where, taking up a challenge, he co-commanded a daring assault that captured 292 Spartans, including 120 pure Spartiates, a shocking surrender that electrified Greece and vaulted Cleon's standing. He showed that non-aristocrats could deliver glory, undercutting old guard claims to exclusive leadership. In the meanwhile, Brasidas, a dynamic Spartan, struck Athens' empire in the north. Facing citizen shortages, he armed 700 helots with a promise of freedom and, in 424 BC, led a lightning campaign through Thrace and Macedonia, persuading cities like Amphipolis to defect with moderate terms and the pose of a liberator. This was effective and alarming. If helots could earn freedom for military service, the line between slave and citizen blurred, unsettling Sparta's social bedrock. After the war, Sparta honored Brasidas' helots as neodamodes, but kept them at arm's length. It was in 422 BC that Cleon and Brasidas faced off at Amphipolis. Brasidas' decisive counterattack killed Cleon during the Athenian retreat. 600 Athenians were killed alongside him, while only 7 Spartans lost their lives. Curiously, among them was also Brasidas. With both hawks gone, hopes for radical reform through war vanished on both sides. The moderates, Nikias in Athens and King Pleistoanax in Sparta, negotiated. The result was the Peace of Nikias in 421 BC, aimed to last 50 years but in practice lasted only about 6. It largely restored the status quo ante. Most conquests were returned, Spartan prisoners from Sphacteria went home, and Athens retained its empire formally. Crucially, neither polis altered its internal system. This was less reconciliation than a pause, a chance for established elites to freeze the conflict before it triggered radical social change. But the underlying tensions, within and between the states, persisted. Between 421 and 415 BC, Athens and Sparta maintained official peace while fighting by proxy. Mistrust simmered. Sparta reasserted land dominance at Mantinea, while in Athens, ambition and the lure of renewed glory culminated in the decision to launch the Sicilian Expedition. Alcibiades, a flamboyant young aristocrat general, sold the assembly on conquering Syracuse as a windfall and a way to encircle Sparta. Beneath the strategy lay a pressure valve promise. Sicily would open new offices, lands, and riches for Athens' restless elite. However, on the eve of departure, Athens awoke to the mutilation of the Herms, sacred boundary statues, and separate accusations that the Eleusinian mysteries had been mocked in private by Alcibiades. His enemies, who most probably framed him, blocked an immediate trial, let him sail, and then recalled him once the armada was at sea. He fled to Thurii, where he was condemned in absentia, and his property was confiscated, an exile born of factional arithmetic more than settled proof. Defecting to Sparta, Alcibiades urged exactly the moves most harmful to Athens. Send Gylippus to stiffen Syracuse and fortify Spartan positions in Athens. The Sicilian attempt ended in utter disaster for Athens by 413 BC. Tens of thousands were lost, and the treasury was wrecked. Instead of gaining new chairs, Athens nearly sawed off the legs of the ones it had. The shock fueled intense turmoil at home. In 411 BC, an oligarchic coup, the 400, briefly seized power. A broader oligarchy, the 5000, followed. Nevertheless, by 410 BC, democracy was restored. These upheavals were elite factions jockeying, oligarchs trying to snatch back control, versus democrats determined not to be shut out, against the backdrop of escalating war. After Sicily, the conflict entered its final phase. Sparta, advised by the defector Alcibiades and buoyed by Persian gold, seized the initiative. King Agis permanently fortified Decelea in Attica, putting Athens under year-round land siege and encouraging more than 20,000 enslaved people to flee. Many of them were skilled miners and artisans. Meanwhile, Sparta's new navy chipped away at Athenian control of the Aegean. When Alcibiades' position soured in Sparta, he shifted to Persia, advising Tissaphernes to play Athens and Sparta off against each other. Persian satraps funded Spartan fleets in exchange for dismantling the Athenian empire city by city. However, in 411, the Athenian fleet at Samos recalled Alcibiades. With his help, Athens scored important victories at Cynossema, Abydos, and Cyzicus, briefly reviving Athenian fortunes, only to be pushed out again after a setback at Notium, for which he took on full responsibility, resulting in his exile. In 405, he warned from exile that the fleet at Aegospotami was exposed, but he was ignored. Subsequently, Athens' last ships were destroyed. Alcibiades' career is a near-perfect exhibit for elite overproduction, a charismatic surplus contender, repeatedly weaponized and expelled by the ruling elites, leading to Athens' final surrender. Meanwhile, Sparta remained wary of fully empowering its lower classes or allies. Spartan naval crews came heavily from allies or mercenaries. When commanders like Lysander accrued too much prestige, authorities rotated them. Even the brilliant Lysander, due to his modest origins, could never be king. He took the war to its conclusion not by revolution, but by methodical attrition. In 405 BC at Aegospotami, it was him who caught the last Athenian fleet off guard and destroyed it. Athens, defenseless at sea and besieged by land, starving and alone, finally agreed to surrender in 404 BC. The terms of surrender, negotiated between the Athenian envoy Theramenes and Lysander, were severe strategically but relatively mild socially. Athens had to tear down its long walls and the walls of Piraeus, surrender all but 12 warships, and dissolve its empire, pulling back from all foreign possessions. Henceforth, it would follow Spartan leadership in foreign policy. Yet Sparta refused to annihilate the city or enslave its people. Instead of imposing a monarchy or permanent occupation, the Spartans installed a friendly oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, backed by a Spartan garrison. For 8 harsh months, the 30, led by Critias and others, carried out purges and confiscations, killing perhaps a significant slice of the citizenry. Even this terror was short-lived. By 403 BC, exiled democrats led by Thrasybulus rallied, overthrew the 30, and restored democracy. In a remarkable act, all parties agreed to a general amnesty, a pledge to set aside most grievances. The democracy was re-established on essentially the same foundations as before, with a renewed commitment to legal stability. Athens reviewed and codified its laws in the following years. In other words, the fundamental social structure of Athens, a citizen body with the same key institutions, survived. On the Spartan side, victory brought no social revolution either. Sparta did not enfranchise more of its own people or emancipate helots en masse. With garrisons and dikarches in conquered cities, Sparta extended its reach, but thinly. At home, Spartan citizens enjoyed spoils and newfound luxuries, yet the rigid Lycurgan system stayed in place. Helots remained helots. No reform addressed the long-term decline in citizen numbers or widening inequalities. Essentially, Sparta bought itself time, a few decades of dominance, without diffusing the volcano beneath it. When we step back, the end of the Peloponnesian War is striking for its conservatism. After so much bloodshed, neither Athens nor Sparta experienced a real revolution in social structure. Athens was humbled and lost its empire, but within a year had a democratic government again, and an amnesty to stitch the civic fabric. Sparta reached the pinnacle of power only to revert to a narrow oligarchy at home. Seen through this lens, many puzzling aspects make sense. The war's protraction was not simply a stalemate of arms. It reflected the fact that neither elite wished to unleash forces that could upend its own order. Arming helots en masse or annihilating Athens would have been decisive and dangerous to the victor's status architecture. Restraint often served established interests. After the deaths of Brasidas and Cleon, both sides leaned toward peace. Later, Sparta spared Athens. Finally, Athens' amnesty drew a line under civil strife. In each case, the status architecture remained largely intact. The war thinned the ranks of disruptive figures by casualties, purges, or exile, temporarily easing elite overproduction, but at staggering cost. Within a generation, Sparta's grip faltered, and Athens, though weakened, remained the same vibrant, contentious democracy. The Peloponnesian War was fought on two fronts, externally between cities and internally to keep each society's pyramid from toppling. In the end, the real objective had never been to revolutionize the other, but to safeguard one's own social order. In a profound sense, it was a war not to change the world, but to keep it the same, for those at the top.